Coming up on today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast, I'm going to tell you why I'm not so sure Reed Blankenship should be a full-time starter on the Eagles defense for the majority of 2024. I'll get into why coming up next on this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Welcome in, Eagles fans, to this Tuesday edition of the podcast. We're brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as the playoffs do wind down. The sport stops sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. Louis DiBiase riding solo today. Gino's in Nashville for a little scouting trip. Shout out to Gino, by the way. One of his guys from the CGS All-Star game, Sharon Stevens, has been really good for the Eagles in back-to-back practices. Had an interception for a pick six yesterday, had a deflected pass in red zone drills today at the end of practice that led to an interception. Stevens has been good, and Gino has been talking him up on Twitter, and he was scouting him running that CGS All-Star game in Texas during the offseason. So Gino knows corners and safeties. That's one of his fortes. So shout out to Gino. He'll be back on the show on Thursday. Really excited for Mark Frazetta joining me tomorrow on the podcast. Of course, you guys know Mark Frazetta from 97.5, The Fanatic in Philadelphia. He's now with us for our Locked On Philadelphia Sports podcast. So he's going to be on the show tomorrow. A lot of exciting things coming up before Friday's preseason opener between the Eagles and the Baltimore Ravens. But today, I wanted to get into some more things about the Eagles secondary, some camp updates, as well as some trade ideas to discuss. And what I want to start the show with is Reed Blankenship. Reed Blankenship has been a really nice surprise for Philadelphia since he was an undrafted rookie in the 2022 offseason. Didn't even think he was going to make the roster that year. Of course, found his way onto the team. It was a weaker safety group before they traded for Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. Blankenship played really well in the summer. Then at one point when CGJ gets injured, when they were kind of rotating through some of their defensive backfield with Avonte Maddox always getting hurt, Reed played really well in that Super Bowl season. That interception against Aaron Rodgers was great. He was one of their more reliable tacklers in the playoffs, in the regular season. Like, he was a really nice surprise. And then even last year, the first half of the season, when they had really bad safety play around him, Reed was a really solid high floor player, a really good communicator, a solid tackler, pretty solid in coverage. Like, you could rely on him. He was a really, really nice story, and it earned him a contract extension this year. But what's interesting, what gets lost in all of this secondary dialogue that we have on this podcast and on Eagles Twitter and all these other shows is, we're discussing like who plays and who doesn't between Kelee Ringo, Isaiah Rodgers, Quinyon Mitchell. Is he in the slot? If he is, what's Cooper DeJean's role? When Sidney Brown comes back, like, where does he fit into this rotation? Should they play this guy here, this guy here? How do we get all these players on the football field? And it feels like there's question marks surrounding so many of these guys: Mitchell, DeJean, Ringo, Rodgers, heck, even Darius Slay to a degree, and Sidney Brown. For some reason, and again, I think Reed's a very solid player, and he earned that extension that he got this offseason. But are we sure Reed Blankenship is so good that he is automatically one of the Eagles' 5 best defensive backs, where he should, and again, I think he's a solid player, but should he be unquestionably somebody that's someone always on the football field over a Cooper DeJean, over a Sidney Jones, I should say Sidney Brown, when those two players do come back? I'm not so sure. I honestly don't think so. I prefer Reed Blankenship when this team's at full strength in the secondary. When Cooper DeJean's back in Sidney Brown, I think there's going to come a point in 2024 where we say Sidney Brown and Cooper DeJean are better players than Reed Blankenship. Reed Blankenship is a better fit as that third rotating safety. And it depends on where you use Cooper DeJean. Is he an outside corner? Is he in the slot? Do you want to use him at safety? But I think Sidney Brown, at least Sidney Brown, when he is healthy, and it sounds like he's running really well, currently on the PUP list, but he's not far off from being back in the practice field. I think there will come a time this year where at least Sidney Brown, we're talking about in a light where we pose a question, is he a more explosive, higher ceiling player than Reed? Does he belong in the field more than this rotational package over Blankenship? I think that's going to become a reality. I already think that's something that the Eagles should explore because I think Cooper DeJean and Sidney Brown are going to be bigger pieces of this puzzle than Reed long term. And again, I'm not saying that he shouldn't be a part of this defense. I think Reed Blankenship is a really high-end third safety, right? And he can play in the box. He can play deep. Like, he is versatile. But I do think you looked at the second half of the season last year, and of course, it wasn't a great situation for anybody on defense. The cornerbacks were banged up and not playing well. The linebackers sucked. The front seven completely disappeared. It wasn't easy for anybody. And I'm not saying Blankenship should have carried them, but I will say when he had to wear more hats, he did show at times he was a coverage liability. Like, he wasn't this dynamic, it's asking a lot to be a Malcolm Jenkins-like player, but he really isn't that guy. And that's totally okay. He can still be a very solid role player for you. And I think on a lot of teams, Reed Blankenship's a starter. I think even on the Eagles, he has earned a starting job. But long-term, if we're talking about like who is the best player when it comes to a ceiling, who's the most dynamic player that you want on the field at all times in all situations, I think there's going to come a time where when they're healthy, Brown and DeJean are guys I'd rather have on the football field than Reed Blankenship. Again, in a vacuum, I like Reed Blankenship, but I do not want him to be a reason that Cooper DeJean and or Sidney Brown are not playing that much football this year. So I don't know. And again, it's just funny because there's question marks on all these guys. There's question marks on Sidney Brown and on Cooper DeJean. Cooper DeJean hasn't played any football yet, and he's injured. Sidney Brown is injured. And last year, he was kind of all over the place. He was a sporadic rookie that showed flashes, but he was kind of uncontrollable and out of position at times and was kind of a liability when it comes to like penalties and in coverage. He showed some flashes, but he was a high variance player. There's questions about Kelee Ringo. There's questions about Isaiah Rodgers, Quinyon Mitchell, Darius Slay. To me, the only guy that should be unquestioned in this secondary right now is Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. And even Chauncey has an injury history. But why is Reed Blankenship not really getting any sort of questions about his role versus these other guys? Like, again, yes, he's been a very solid player for, I'd say, the last like year and a half, the second half of 2022, the first half of 2023. But has he been that good where he shouldn't have to compete at all with all these other defensive backs that are being trained in multiple spots? I don't know. Like, again, for me, my ideal secondary long-term for the Eagles, like if it was up to me, I would be putting my top five. And again, they're going to use 6-7 defensive backs at times this year. So all of these guys are going to play to a degree. And of course there are injuries too. But if I was creating my ideal best five in the defensive backfield, it's Quinyon Mitchell on the outside. It's Darius Slay for this year on the outside. I'd have Isaiah Rodgers in the slot. And my two safeties would be Chauncey Gardner-Johnson and Cooper DeJean. And I'm sorry, I almost would prefer Sidney Brown eventually to be that third safety over Reed. Like, Reed might be my fourth, fifth, maybe I would say like he's the fourth guy at safety if Cooper DeJean would play that position. Now, if Cooper is in the slot, then Sidney Brown to me eventually would be that second safety and Reed Blankenship would be the third rotating player. That's not what I think the Eagles are going to do. What I think is going to happen. That's what I would prefer. That's where I'm at with Reed Blankenship. But it's just funny that, I don't know, he's just like unquestioned while all these other guys are competing for jobs. He really isn't. And I know why this team likes him a lot, but I don't know. You guys know I kind of lean towards the younger ceiling players over the floor guy, but I just think it's interesting that he's right now seen as somebody that's like untouchable. Like, his spot is untouchable. Of course, the two guys I'm talking about, they're not even available. So this is more of a moot point until those guys are on the football field. This is more of a conversation for when those guys are available. I want them on the field. It's a great problem to have, though. I said this yesterday. It's a great problem to have when there's 7 to 8 defensive backs that you want on the field and you just can't get them all on the field. That means you have crazy depth, and that's a really good thing. But just thought that was interesting that Reed Blankenship really isn't talked about. There aren't a lot of questions about, hey, what's his role long-term versus these other guys when he's been good the last 2 years, but he hasn't been great, and it's been up and down. So that's kind of where I'm at with the Reed Blankenship situation. Not really a situation, but just the entire secondary situation. All right, guys, coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast, we're going to get into some training camp updates from Tuesday's practice. The Eagles' first unofficial depth chart also did come out. A look at that as well coming your way on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Eagles. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast, we are brought to you by FanDuel. Look, you guys know I love sports. I love them so much that I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs do wind down, we get fewer games in the sports. They're just not sportsing like we want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I got to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. I'm feeling a future on Jalen Hurts winning MVP. Maybe I'm feeling Saquon Barkley for Offensive Player of the Year. You can bet on that all and more. The Philadelphia Phillies, the Olympics, all of it on FanDuel. They're hooking you up with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everybody, every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball and the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, want to let you know your second listen should absolutely be the Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast. Get daily insight to the best fantasy draft strategies so you can win your league this season. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So the Eagles were on the practice field yet again at the NovaCare Complex today for Tuesday's practice. Got a couple more. Friday, we have a game finally to discuss. Eagles, Ravens in Baltimore, Maryland. Let's take a look at the depth chart, though, before that game. And again, keep in mind, when the Eagles do release that first official, or I should say unofficial depth chart, it's not done by Howie Roseman. It's not done by the coaches. This is done primarily by the communications department, by the PR staff. When it comes to some takeaways from that depth chart, though, I don't really know if there's much to take away. Tyler Steen was listed as the starting right guard, but Mekhi Becton was not listed as a tackle. He was listed as the backup right guard. Linebackers, they were not given a designated starter or two starters. It was Devin White / Nakobe Dean, Zach Bond / Jeremiah Trotter Jr. Had the same situation at corner, Isaiah Rodgers / Kelee Ringo, but it wasn't / Quinyon Mitchell. He was behind Darius Slay on the depth chart. Avonte Maddox listed as a nickel corner. James Bradbury listed as one of those primary backup safeties. I don't know. There really isn't much to take from this yet. And again, the preseason hasn't even started yet. What is interesting is the kick returner was Isaiah Rodgers, along with Paris Campbell. The punt returner was Britton Covey. I kind of like the idea of Isaiah Rodgers as one of those kick returners. This is a guy that, especially if he doesn't start you at corner, I would like to see him as a returner. He has a 4.28 40-yard dash, and I think he's faster than that now, the way he's looking in practice. He actually returned a kickoff for the Indianapolis Colts for a touchdown back in 2022. So I like that idea for Rodgers. I think it was notable that he was listed as the top kick returner. When Cooper DeJean's back, by the way, he's another player I would like to see get a shot as a return man. He was very, very good as a returner at Iowa. The Iowa Hawkeyes won a few games because of Cooper DeJean's ability to return punts and kicks. So thought that was interesting, but overall, take that depth chart with a grain of salt. It's done by the communications department. Of course, they have a good idea of what this team is thinking right now, but it's before the first preseason game. We haven't even had joint practices. We've had a few live sessions with pads, but overall, take that all with a grain of salt. What you should take more into account is what they're doing in practice. And although Tyler Steen was listed as the first team right guard, Mekhi Becton, for the second straight day with both healthy, did get the first crack at the first team right guard spot over Tyler Steen. And I think it's more noteworthy today than it was yesterday, because yesterday was Tyler Steen's first practice back from the ankle injury. We were wondering, with Becton starting off in team drills as the first team right guard, if that was an indication that he's in the lead for the job now, or was it just, this is Steen's first day back, like he wasn't really participating in team drills? Is it something to keep an eye on? Today, we kind of got that question answered with Becton getting first dibs again at right guard. Tyler Steen did eventually rotate through with the first team offensive line, but the fact that Becton got the nod again for the second straight day, to me, shows the Eagles want Becton to win this job. I think they thought Steen would win it. I think it was a safer bet to predict Steen would win it, because Becton has been a high variance starting tackle. You look at that size, like normally guards aren't that big. Like I think they wanted Becton to be that guy because of his elite power in between Cam Jurgens and Lane Johnson, like especially on the ground in the run game. It'd be nice to have that kind of length and power next to Lane, next to a undersized lineman like a Cam Jurgens. But I think they thought Steen would more likely be the guy that wins the job. Steen got hurt. Becton took advantage of that. He has shown flashes over the last 2 weeks, and it shows the Eagles wanted him to win the job because instantly, like Tyler Steen didn't do much to really give up the job before he was hurt. But look at the minute he wasn't available, Becton took the job, and now they're not giving it back to Steen. So the preseason is going to tell us a lot about that camp battle. But right now, I do think Becton is the favorite over Tyler Steen to win that job. And whoever doesn't win it, I think you can expect is the first man off the bench for the offensive line, whether it's left tackle, right guard, left guard. Whoever doesn't win the right guard battle between Steen and Becton, that's going to be your swing Halapoulivaati Vaitai type of offensive lineman for sure. So although the depth chart said Steen is the starting right guard, I think Becton's the favorite to be that guy right now. Isaiah Rodgers, by the way, 5th straight day starting practice off as the second corner on the outside opposite Darius Slay over Kelee Ringo. I will say Quinyon Mitchell did get some first team looks today. That's noteworthy. Quinyon blanketed A.J. Brown on a rep today. He picked up a sack on a nickel blitz against Jalen Hurts. He made that impressive run fit tackle yesterday in the red zone. I'm so impressed with Quinyon Mitchell. I know Isaiah Rodgers, like this is an awesome story. He's been suspended all year, comes back, has to fight off Kelee Ringo, who the Eagles traded up for last year, giving up a 3rd round pick. They took Quinyon Mitchell in the 1st round, and here's Isaiah Rodgers beating them both out for this outside job. Like that is impressive, but Quinyon is not doing anything to show that he can't be that guy on the outside or in the nickel. The fact that anything the NFL has thrown at this kid because there were so many questions about him because he came out of Toledo as primarily an off-zone coverage corner. People were nervous about Quinyon, and they loved the skill set. So the NFL has thrown him to the wolves. They're like, okay, this is all we saw you do at a small MAC conference school. So let's see, can you play press man coverage against some of the best receivers in the country in Mobile for the Senior Bowl? Can you play in the slot? Can you run fit? Can you cover A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith one-on-one? And all of these new questions, all of these check marks on this list that the NFL is throwing at Quinyon Mitchell, he keeps checking them off. And again, we haven't had any live game action, but early on, every time the NFL has challenged Quinyon and has wondered if he can handle this bigger workload with higher competition than he had at Toledo, all these question marks they had on him that they wanted to have answered. So they threw him into those situations. He has thrived. And again, it's so impressive because he really didn't do any of this at Toledo. He didn't play in the slot. He didn't play a lot of man coverage. He did not go up against A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, heck, even Roman Wilson and Xavier Legette at the Senior Bowl. He didn't go up against a Ricky Parasol. And yet, you look at his skill set and the Eagles banked on him being able, it was a projection, but they banked on him being able to become that guy and do all those things. And every time the NFL said, hey, let's see it on the field, Quinyon's been that guy. And I really hope that continues into the preseason, into the regular season. Early on, I think the Eagles nailed that draft pick. Again, that's just my early inclination, but I feel like they nailed it. Zach Bond, once again, first team linebacker next to Devin White, Nakobe Dean, Jeremiah Trotter Jr. rotating in on those spots. Zach Bond, though, I mean, I'm very surprised that he just continues to be that first team guy, but it sounds like he's earning it. Maybe he is this year's Kazir White, where he's just this veteran, cheap first 1 year deal that just never messes up. It sounds like his play recognition has been really impressive. His toughness. I mean, we heard Nick Sirianni mention him by name the other day. This is kind of going back to the Reed Blankenship conversation in segment 1. I still want Nakobe Dean or Jeremiah Trotter Jr. to win that job because I think they're more long-term answers at that position. Whereas Zach Bond, Devin White, 1 year veterans, I'm not sure if they'll earn extensions next year. Howie Roseman rarely pays linebackers, even if they do play well that year, i.e. TJ Edwards and Kazir White. So I prefer if Dean or Trotter took that job eventually. But right now, Zach Bond is not giving them a reason to bench him. And again, the preseason will tell all, but Zach Bond sounds like he's been really, really impressive. So those are some of the big noteworthy things from practice today. Mekhi Becton, first team right guard over Tyler Steen. Isaiah Rodgers, yet again, getting the nod at CB2 over Kelee Ringo. But Quinyon Mitchell keeps making plays in practice. Zach Bond sounds like he's got a stranglehold right now as that majority second inside linebacker next to Devin White. All right, guys, coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast, as we do every Tuesday in segment 3, what's more likely? And it has to do with trades. We'll get into that coming up next right here on Locked On Eagles. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by BetterHelp Online Therapy. When your schedule is packed with kids' activities, big work projects, and more, it's easy to let your priorities slip. Even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard to make time for it. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. Like football season gets really busy for me. I have to make sure I'm disciplined. I take the time to log on to BetterHelp and get that therapy. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. And the good thing is when you're busy, it's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp.com/lockedon for 10% off your first month of online therapy. All right, time now for what's more likely right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast as we wrap up this Tuesday edition of the show. Today's question does come from Chris on Twitter, who writes in, what's more likely? The Eagles trade before the season for a wide receiver / tight end or the field. So what's more likely? The Eagles trade for any other position that's not a pass catcher, or is it a receiver or tight end? This is a good question. I think the Eagles will make one more, I don't want to say it's a big move, but a decent size move before the regular season starts. And it won't be in the form of a waiver claim, a free agency signing. I do think Howie Roseman will make one trade before the season starts. Gun to my head, I would say it's for a receiver or a tight end. Really, I mean, Johnny Wilson's been impressive. Britton Covey has made some plays. Paris Campbell when he was healthy, but Johnny Wilson's a 6th-round rookie. I don't know if they want to rely on him full-time this year. Same with Britton Covey. Paris Campbell really never stays healthy. You know, they keep mentioning Aaron Moorhead, the receiver coach, Kellen Moore. They all keep mentioning a committee approach. They all have different skill sets that they want to utilize. Same with Ainias Smith if he makes some plays. John Ross, which I totally get that mentality. But I think another reason they're talking about a committee is that nobody's really running away with the job. So I could totally see them, you know, if a Sky Moore got cut, right? Or a Treylon Burks eventually when DeAndre Hopkins is healthy with the Tennessee Titans. I could see the Eagles trying to bring in another top draft pick that fell out of favor with their team to compete with these players or make a small end trade for one of those guys. I could totally see that, or a trade for a tight end. I think that's the most likely outcome. I think that is more likely, but I will say there are some other positions that the Eagles could trade for. And I think one that's underrated is defensive tackle. Now, again, the Eagles are banking on these young kids to step up, and I think they will. Jalen Carter, Milton Williams, Jordan Davis. It sounds like my guy Moro Ojomo continues to make plays in the preseason, or I should say in training camp, hopefully in the preseason as well, like he did last year. Marlon Tuipulotu looks pretty solid, but let's say preseason those guys don't flash. Early on in the regular season, those guys aren't carrying the load and you feel the absence of a Fletcher Cox. I could see defensive tackle being a position where Howie Roseman says, I just need one more piece. Like I need one more veteran guy to be a part of this rotation. If suddenly we need Moro Ojomo and or Marlon Tuipulotu to have a bigger role than we thought, and they're not stepping up. Like I'm very optimistic about both of those guys. Ojomo put some good tape on last summer. Marlon Tuipulotu, before he got hurt last year, the first half of the year, was a pretty solid backup to Jordan Davis as the zero tech, showed off some much improved pass rush skills. So I'm excited about those guys. I think between those five, they're going to be okay. But you never know. They're all very young and have only flashed. They haven't become full-time players yet. And you mentioned, I mentioned the other day that Vic Fangio said in his press conference, he wants at least 5 to 7 true defensive linemen. And what he means by that is he doesn't consider edge players defensive linemen like the Eagles have in the past. So he wasn't saying 5 to 7 guys that include Josh Sweat, Bryce Huff, Jalix Hunt, like Nolan Smith, not those guys. He said he wants 5 to 7 interior defensive linemen on this team. So even if those 5 guys are your main players, I could see, instead of keeping it like a Gabe Hall as that 6th man on the inside, I could see Vic Fangio going to Howie Roseman saying, hey, you got to go trade for, give me one more veteran, like bring in one more guy for me here. So I have a solid 6-man rotation like they did back in 2022 when they were very deep. I mean, they were rotating through Cox, Hargrave, Davis, Linval Joseph, Sue, Milton Williams. They had a deep 6-man rotation. I think Vic Fangio wants that again. So I could see defensive tackle being a position they trade for. But I would say what's more likely, it is that the Eagles trade for a receiver or a tight end before the season starts or early on during the regular season. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Thanks so much for making us your first listen each and every day. Mark Farzetta joining me on the show tomorrow. Until then, make sure your second listen is the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast. Get daily insight to the best fantasy draft strategies so you can win your league this season. You can find the link to Locked On Fantasy Football in the description, so you don't need to search it. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, thanks so much for downloading, watching, and listening. And let's go Birds. Fly, Eagles, fly.